Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, August 15th, 2024, and today we are going to be taking a look at a 2024 presidential election prediction. Now, this is my prediction right before the Democratic National Convention, and so I'm excited to see exactly how this changes in around 2 weeks' time. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I create election predictions right before an upcoming presidential or midterm election, and in the final 3 months of it, I do election predictions every 2 weeks leading up to the election, and in the final week, I do them just days out and the day before the presidential election. Now, the 2024 cycle has been one that has certainly been far more volatile than any of us could have even imagined. Just 2 months ago, we were working with an entirely new candidate. In fact, an entirely different candidate, rather. In fact, a month ago, the same could be said. And so in the past 3 weeks, so much has changed in favor of the Democratic Party that we've seen whiplash when it comes down to our election predictions. A month ago, I had Joe Biden losing to Donald Trump with just 226 electoral votes on the Democratic Party side, 312 to the Republicans, and it looked pretty grim for the Democratic Party. Today, the circumstances don't look exactly the same. And I released a prediction roughly 2 weeks ago. At the start of the month, August 2nd, I released my first ever Kamala Harris Donald Trump election prediction. But the good news is that since the announcement of Tim Walz as the vice president, I've adjusted those ratings quite a bit, and now we have our first ever 2024 prediction with VP Tim Walz on the ticket that is going to be predicted for November. Now, on our screen right now, we're working with a very blank electoral map, a map that probably doesn't look too similar, to what we will see on election night, given that every single state, hopefully, God willing, will be characterized by that evening or in the morning. But the 2024 cycle, I think, really will show exactly how close these states are going to be. I mean, we've really been under this assumption that at one point in time it was going to be extremely close, and then a Trump blowout, and now we're starting to get to a point where Kamala Harris is doing well. But I do want us to remember that this election has been engineered to be a close and competitive race. The rematch election, the dynamics of it all, the fundraising numbers of it all, I mean, we are in a very, very different political space than we were even 4 years ago during the COVID-19 pandemic, or 4 years prior in the 2016 election. We are in uncharted territory. 100 days out from the presidential election, the Democratic nominee for president dropped, and now we're seeing that Kamala Harris has been taking the helm and actually doing quite well with it, in a complete change from what people were expecting of her in earlier stages of her old presidential campaigns, or potentially even in older campaigns dating that. But this cycle, again, has thrown us all for a loop and a half, and I'm excited to see what we find on election day. So right now, I'm going to spend no time characterizing any of the states beyond the safe right now, just so we can get through these, help us understand that these states are going to be pretty solid for the Democratic or Republican parties, not spend too much time talking about them. What you need to know is essentially that Kamala Harris starts off this race with 181 electoral votes. The Republicans start off with 107, and those are going to be characterized momentarily. Now, safe states are states where we know they're going to go no matter who the party nominee is going to be to either political party. These are states that essentially we have full confidence that the Republicans are going to win in states like Oklahoma, in states like Montana, whereas if it's a state like Georgia or Ohio, it's going to be a bit more competitive than you might think. And so at baseline, Donald Trump is at 107 electoral votes. It's a little bit less than I had in my last prediction, but I want to give you just a bit of an understanding as to why that might be. The way I do my ratings here, and you can see it in the description box down below if you want more detailed explanations of why I do my ratings this way. But essentially what I do is I characterize based on margin. I don't like to do predictive chance, because I don't think it would be fair to say a state like Minnesota, for instance, with Tim Walz on the ticket, probably has around a 95% chance of going to Kamala Harris, to share a characterization with a state like California, which has a 99% chance of going to Kamala Harris. And so I think where we are right now is that Minnesota, California should not share the same characterization, and so I go by margin. And so my tilt margins are anywhere between 0 and 1%. That means a state like Kansas, if it was to go to Trump by 0.5%, would be a tilt state. Lean would be anywhere between 1 to 5 points. So again, if Trump was to win Kansas by 3 points, it would be a lean state. Likely is anywhere above 5 to 15 percentage points, nearing that edge of safe, but still in a position where in a super different circumstance could go to the opposition party. And then a safe state is a state that is decided by 15 points plus, pretty much locked down and solid, no chance, no matter the circumstance, no matter the situation, that a state like Kansas goes to the opposition party. But Kansas actually is a unique example for this, because it's actually the first state that I want to first start off talking about that I've changed characterizations for my last election prediction. Previously, I had Kansas as a safe red state because I did believe that Donald Trump was going to outperform his 2020 electoral margins in nearly every single state. We had full expectations that he was going to defeat Joe Biden, and even in his matchup against Kamala Harris, her improvements were pretty concentrated to the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt and not anywhere else. But since a lot of new data points have come out and we've seen the improvement with Tim Walz on the ticket and our favorability starting to go up, and a bunch of different data points and metrics that show Kamala Harris in a far better position than even where she was at the moment she announced her campaign, I do think Kansas, which was a likely red state in 2020, will share that characterization again in 2024. Same thing in South Carolina, which was a 10-point state for Donald Trump, and Alaska, which was 10.1%, actually shared the same margin as a state like Virginia back in 2020. To put those back into context, these states are going to be pretty solid for Donald Trump, but still more competitive than safe states that we see like Missouri or Indiana. Now, there are certainly some other Democratic states and Republican states that deserve likely characterization, so we're going to spend our time characterizing those. And I wanted to pretty much address the states that at face value might be perceived as swing states given the 2016 election, the 2020 election, the 2012 election, but may not be truly swing states this cycle. The Democratic and Republican campaigns have made it very clear. Their focus are on the 7 crucial battleground states that they deem to be the most important: Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Outside of that, it's pretty free game for the Democrats and Republicans because they aren't spending a lot of money there. They aren't opening up campaign field offices in the same way. The Republican campaign under Donald Trump got a big boost under the Joe Biden matchup. They believed that they were on track for a very solid victory, and so they actually tried to expand their electoral map and still have campaign field offices in states like Virginia and New Mexico and Minnesota, even though there was no real indication that they were going to lose the state, or win the state. Pretty much, though, a lot of these likely characterizations are now coming from states where the Trump campaign previously thought, hey, this could be a point where we really do well against Joe Biden, but under a Kamala Harris candidacy, just simply have no chance at winning. And these are states like Minnesota that are going to be likely blue, states that are going to be decided by anywhere between 5 to 15 points. And if I was to call today, Kamala Harris wins Minnesota by 10. She also wins Virginia by 10. She wins it by the same margin that Joe Biden did, and that isn't really a shock to anyone. She very much has wrapped up the Asian American vote in a way that Joe Biden did not, and that is particularly useful in states like Virginia, where there's a high concentration of Asian American voters, in places like Northern Virginia, some of the highest turnout voters in elections, routinely Democratic-based voters that shifted away in 2021, but shifted back for 2024, and especially in 2022, Virginia's a state where we could certainly see Kamala Harris do quite well in. Point being, beyond that, though, Kamala Harris has certainly improved amongst suburban voters, specifically white suburban women, where Kamala Harris is seeing the massive gender gap really being attributed to the fact that white suburban women are moving in favor of Kamala Harris as some of the most populous sections of the vote base that we see for Democrats routinely. That base improving for Kamala Harris and being more inspired to turn out, more excited in this election, makes states like Virginia and Minnesota more electable for Kamala Harris, and so it becomes a likely blue state. She also carries states like Colorado, New Mexico over the finish line. Colorado went to Biden by 14 back in 2020, New Mexico by 10. Shouldn't really be a shock that they're going to be likely blue states again. All you really need to know is that they used to be competitive states, but Democrats in recent elections, especially in the Trump era, have completely turned that around to being very reliable Democratic states on the Senate level, House level, gubernatorial level, and of course on the presidential. So that brings Kamala Harris to 219 electoral votes. She also, to pretty much top her off here, has states like Maine, New Hampshire, and Nebraska's 2nd District really show exactly what she can do when it pertains to white voters. In the Omaha region, in the Maine region, in New Hampshire, you really see that Kamala Harris has a base. And while the base may be primarily built up of minority voters across key battleground states, in some of the areas where the voting population is 80% plus or more white voters, she still tends to do well, and especially in these states that are more Democratic leaning. She, in fact, outpaces Joe Biden in states like Nebraska and New Hampshire and Maine, and the data is clear and consistent on that. And I think a big reason for that is because Kamala Harris has built up what many Democrats refer to as this big tent party that brings in more than it pushes out. Very different than the Trump campaign, which is very big on bashing Nikki Haley supporters, bashing any supporters that didn't vote for Trump in the 2024 Republican primaries. And they've built up this really, shove out, insulate in the type of Republican for the 2024 election in the MAGA party. Laura Trump runs the Republican Party, versus Democrats with Kamala Harris that have brought in more people. They welcome with open arms Nikki Haley voters. They welcome with open arms Republicans who feel pushed away by Donald Trump. They try to capture in far more voters, and it seems particularly helpful in states like New Hampshire, where Nikki Haley had her best primary performance, in states like Maine, where the voters there are more focused on freedom and shifting away from authoritarianism, as the Democratic campaign paints Donald Trump as an authoritarian. You look at states like Nebraska, where Nebraska's 2nd District should be a more conservative district. Republicans tried to gerrymander it, didn't work. Kamala Harris on track for a likely victory there, bringing her number to 226 electoral votes. But Donald Trump still has his fair share of likely states outstanding, states like Iowa and Ohio, which typically vote together and have shifted away quite tremendously in the post-Obama era. Ever since Donald Trump had entered into politics, these two states have grown to adore Donald Trump. His approvals are still through the roof in the states, and there's no real consideration here that Democrats are going to be spending money on the race either. Ohio and Iowa are going to be states that Democrats aren't going to be able to win, no matter what happens, no matter who's on the ballot, no matter any circumstance. Kamala Harris is not winning Ohio, and she's not winning Iowa. These are states that Donald Trump is certainly going to win, bringing him to 140 148 electoral votes. He won both of these states by 8 points plus in both 2016 and 2020. I have no doubts that he does something similar again in 2024, even if narrowly reducing it. The next state we want to talk about is the state of Florida. 30 electoral votes brings Donald Trump to 178 electoral votes. Kamala Harris still at 226. The 30 electoral votes in Florida are, of course, important, but Democrats don't see it as main priority this election, very different than what they saw back in 2020. And I think a big reason for that is because they felt very upset that in 2020, Florida was a state they invested over $100 million in. Biden visited the state multiple times. They genuinely believed, because Hillary Clinton lost the state by a point, that Joe Biden could be the person to flip it back. The polls even suggested that Joe Biden was going to win. He did not win in this state. In fact, Republicans expanded their margin, and then in 2022 really showed that this state is pretty conservative, and there isn't really a doubt behind that. So 178 electoral votes in Florida, across the nation, with Florida being added into the bunch. The final characterization that would be likely read is Maine's 2nd district, which is pretty locked down for Donald Trump. We have seen some recent data points suggesting that Maine's 2nd is narrowing down a bit in favor of Kamala Harris, but until I start to see more consistent data, I'm going to say Maine's 2nd right now is Donald Trump's likely rating because of what we saw in 2022, in 2020, and even 2016. So Maine's 2nd, Donald Trump district, leaving us with 133 toss-up electoral votes. Now, I don't want to get anyone on here who is a Democrat or Republican, freaking out about a state like Texas being in the final few in the 8 states here, because I do believe the 7 that we've talked about, again, Nevada through Georgia, are the states that are the most important in this cycle. But Texas is certainly interesting because Donald Trump won the state by 5.6 in the last election, and I do believe that this upcoming election, he will win it by less. Does that mean he loses the state? No. It doesn't mean that Ted Cruz loses either. But what it does mean is that Donald Trump has certainly lost support, and Kamala Harris's approval rating, especially on topics that are really, really difficult for Joe Biden to navigate, topics like immigration and the southern border crisis, Kamala Harris outpolls Joe Biden. And while it certainly isn't a winning issue for Democrats, she does do better. Her favorabilities are higher, and her electability chances really just increased since she became the nominee. And especially amongst Latino and Hispanic voters, Kamala Harris does far better than Joe Biden and brings back that energy amongst young Latino voters, older Latino voters, whatever it might be. She does well in Texas, and she does well across the nation, but it does not mean that she wins Texas. And so in our final 93 electoral votes, we're really focused, again, on those core 7 states that Democrats and Republicans see as key and crucial for their election victories. Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia speak to 2 levels that her campaign can do well in, based on their recent elections. First, with Governor Tim Walz as her vice presidential nominee, does well in the Rust Belt. He did well in Minnesota in 2022. He certainly did much better in 2018. He knows how to win in these regions. He knows how to win Trump districts, Republican districts. He was in Congress in a bipartisan district that went back and forth between Democrats and Republicans, and Minnesota is a great state to come from to learn how to win in states like Wisconsin. We'll learn how to win in states like Michigan, learn how to win in states like Pennsylvania. And with that being said, I do believe that at this point in time, Kamala Harris stands to be the favorite in all 3 of those battleground states, meaning that if they all go to Kamala Harris, which I think the margin here isn't going to change, she wins the election on these states alone. But that leaves us with 49 remaining electoral votes. I mean, we're not just going to see her win the 270 through the Rust Belt and win nothing else. Though some people believe that is a likely outcome of this election, that is not the outcome I believe we are going to see this November. And I think a big reason for that is because Kamala Harris, while she is going to win in the Rust Belt, can win elsewhere. She also is that other half of it. Tim Walz does well in the Rust Belt, and so does she in a way. She did better even without Tim Walz on the ticket, but she does much better in the Sun Belt region. What we saw in Arizona now is that Kamala Harris has a narrow lead. On the day that Joe Biden dropped out of the race, he was down 5, 6, 7 points in Arizona. In Georgia, he was down 5, 6 points. Today, Kamala Harris has a narrow 0.1% advantage, according to FiveThirtyEight. These improvements and these changes in the map here cannot be ignored because Kamala Harris does something that Joe Biden could not. That is riles up the Democratic base, especially minority voters, specifically black and brown voters, specifically every single demographic group besides white voters, and she even improves amongst white voters. It is pretty consistent that what we see on our national landscape is that Kamala Harris makes improvements in a way that is beneficial for the Democratic Party, no matter how you slice the cake. And so states like Georgia and North Carolina and Arizona and Nevada are now back on the radar for Democrats in a way that they weren't previously under Joe Biden, but it doesn't mean they're all going to go to Kamala Harris. I still believe that North Carolina and Georgia are Trump states right now. I think Georgia's very close election in the last in 2020 goes to show that even in a circumstance where a lot of other states were swinging tremendously, although Georgia did, it wasn't tremendous enough to say that it becomes a lockdown Democratic state. The 2022 midterms should also worry Democrats because with the stellar Democratic nominee and a very weak Republican nominee, they only won the runoff election in Georgia by just 2 points. And the governor's race went to Republicans by 7 versus Arizona, which is in direct contrast, that went to Democrats in the governor's race and in the Senate race by 5 points. A massive, massive victory for Democrats in Arizona. Not as much in the state of Georgia. North Carolina is a bit more reasonable to understand. It's a state that hasn't gone to Democrats in a very long time, and it just reasonably is far more conservative and right-leaning than other people might expect. North Carolina right now is a state that I would say Donald Trump is the advantage in, and same thing in the state of Georgia. But when it comes down to Nevada, I've been adamant. I believe Kamala Harris wins the state by a lean or tilt margin. I'm now narrowing a little bit more onto the tilt side because of what we saw in recent polls from the Cook Political Report, and also what we generally know about the state and Donald Trump's strength, and also just the changes and the delta between the Senate Democrat Jackie Rosen and Kamala Harris. I think the gap there is massive, 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 and if Democrats can reduce it, which I do think Kamala Harris still, hold the election day, wins Nevada very narrowly, can be done to expand the margin to a 2.4% or a 3-4 point margin that we saw back in 2020. Nevada right now, I think, is a narrow Kamala Harris state, but it isn't a massive victory at all. The final state that I want to characterize is the state of Arizona, and that is because I am switching its characterization from my last video from being a tilt red state to a tilt blue state. With the news out of the abortion referendum in Arizona combined with Kamala Harris's consistent and expanding improvements amongst Latino voters, Arizona is a state where I do believe Kamala Harris can make improvements upon enough so that if the election was held today, she wins in Arizona. It's 11 electoral votes, a very competitive state. It's one that is really going to matter in this cycle, and it brings her to 287 electoral votes. I do believe she has the unique ability to appeal to Arizona in a way that Joe Biden did back in 2020, but potentially do even better. I think she could potentially win Arizona by 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, maybe even a point or more. And while that may be something that would have seemed like a pipe dream a month ago under Joe Biden, it is our reality today. Especially with that abortion referendum on the ballot, I very well see Arizona being a state that is well within reach for Democrats, not only on the presidential level, but certainly on the Senate level, and potentially many of the House districts that are competitive. And so our final electoral map here is 287 to 251, a victory for Kamala Harris. She flips Arizona for my last prediction, and overall, based on the 2020 map, only loses the state of Georgia. It's an electoral victory that is strong for the Democratic Party. It's not massive, and it's not what it was in 2020, but it's decisive, and it shows that Kamala Harris has a pathway to the presidency that extends beyond the Rust Belt, meaning if a state like Wisconsin was to flip red, Arizona would come in and save the Democrats and allow them a victory over 270 electoral votes. So again, final map here, 287 for Kamala Harris, 251 for Donald Trump. The convention is just next week, and we have a lot more to discuss and a lot more to see between now and Election Day, and so it'll be interesting to see how these change every 2 weeks, because right now marks the beginning of our every 2 week series of the 2024 election in terms of predictions, and I'm really excited to see how it changes over time ahead of the 2024 election, which is just 81 days away. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist of my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.